Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling called her, his voice dripping with contempt as he swept past Hannah Clarke's medication card during morning rounds. Not even looking at her. Never looking at her. The words hung in the oncology ward's recycled air like the smell of antiseptic that never quite faded, no matter how many times the housekeeping staff scrubbed the linoleum. Hannah didn't flinch. She kept her hand steady as she checked the 4-pump on room 302, the fluorescent lights humming their endless mechanical song above her head. 20 years of muscle memory took over, the kind of muscle memory she never discussed, never acknowledged, never let surface in the bright corridors of Oak Creek Memorial where she'd chosen to disappear. The thing about being invisible is that it works both ways. They didn't see her hands move with the precise economy of someone who'd threaded medical lines by flashlight under incoming mortar fire. They didn't see the way her eyes tracked vitals and patient stability like she was reading a battlefield report. They didn't see the senior chief petty officer buried underneath 20 years of scrubs and deliberate humility. Room 304 was where the complication started. Hannah pushed the med cart to the doorway and paused. The patient, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, a Navy SEAL recovering from abdominal surgery, 3 days post-op, was watching her with an intensity that made something in her chest clench. His eyes were grey-blue, the kind of eyes that had seen hard things, and when she stepped into the room to check his full line, something flickered across his face. Recognition. Fear. Something she couldn't name. She kept her expression neutral, the mask of the quiet nurse firmly in place. Her hands moved through the routine check with practiced precision, inspecting the catheter site for infection, verifying the drip rate, documenting the output. But for just a moment, one unguarded second, her hands trembled. Actual tremor. Her own body betraying her. She gripped the bed rail to steady herself, her knuckles going white against the cold stainless steel. Not here. Not now. Not in front of a SEAL who might recognize something in her that she'd spent 2 decades learning to hide. Feeling all right, Sergeant? Her voice came out soft, the voice of a floor nurse asking routine questions. Not the voice of the person who'd carried an 8-year-old Afghan boy 3 miles through Helmand Province under sniper fire. Not the voice of someone who'd held a medical line together while rockets hit the perimeter. Yeah. He studied her face like he was trying to solve an equation. Yeah, I'm good. She adjusted his pillow and left without meeting his eyes, her pulse still elevated, the scar on her left forearm burning like it did whenever the past tried to break through. That scar, shrapnel from a mortar attack in 2004, the same attack that had separated her from Marcus Webb for 17 years, was hidden under her scrubs now, just another invisible part of the invisible person she'd become. In her locker, 3 floors down in the basement break room where few people ventured, sat a pair of worn combat boots. Still stained with Helmand Province dust. Still stained with things she didn't talk about. She'd packed them into the back of the locker on her first day at Oak Creek Memorial, buried them under folded scrubs like grave goods, and hadn't looked at them since. Some days she forgot they were there. Most days, she remembered, and the memory felt like a weight that never quite lifted. Dr. Sterling arrived for morning rounds at 9:27 a.m., his expensive shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of a man who owned the space he walked through. Italian leather, Hannah noticed. Probably cost more than her monthly rent. He swept through the corridor with a junior resident trailing behind him like a satellite, his chart tucked under his arm, his expression already dismissive of whatever medical reality he was about to encounter. He barely glanced at Hannah as he passed her station. Never acknowledged her. It was like she was furniture, something functional, something in the background, something that didn't require acknowledgement. She'd long since learned not to expect otherwise. Clarke. He said her name like it tasted bad. Patient in 307 is presenting elevated white count. Check the cultures. Already done. Hannah kept her voice level, professional. Results came back at 0847. Gram-positive cocci, pending sensitivity. Sterling's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't like being corrected, even when the correction was accurate. Especially when it was accurate. Well, the attending should have been notified. The attending was. Dr. Paxton ordered empiric clindamycin 2 hours ago. He moved past her without responding, which was worse than any insult. The absence of acknowledgement felt like erasure. Hannah had learned to live with erasure. It was safer that way. Invisibility kept you alive. By mid-morning, the ward had settled into its routine rhythm. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical songs in the ICU section. Medication pumps beeped their steady intervals. The overhead paging system crackled with announcements that made Hannah's military reflexes twitch each time, her body remembering radio alerts and incoming fire warnings that had nothing to do with hospital logistics. She was adjusting the oxygen saturation monitor in room 312 when she overheard Sterling in the hallway, speaking to one of the younger nurses, Rebecca, fresh out of her RN program, still wearing that eager expression that hadn't yet been worn down by experience. The medication dosing protocols these nurses follow. Sterling's voice carried the weight of institutional authority. Half of them don't understand pharmacokinetics. They just push pills because they've always pushed pills that way. Hannah's hands didn't pause. She continued documenting, her penmanship precise and deliberate, every letter exactly like the last. The mask stayed in place. This was familiar territory. This was the landscape she'd learned to navigate. The break room at 11:53 a.m. was a study in subtle rejection. Hannah had brought her usual lunch, a protein box from the hospital cafeteria, nothing fancy, nothing that required conversation, and sat at the table by the window overlooking Denver's gray skyline. Within 90 seconds, 3 nurses who'd been sitting near her stood up and migrated to another table. Not because she'd said anything. Not because she'd done anything. Just because her presence seemed to carry a kind of contagion that made people uncomfortable. She'd stopped taking it personally around year 5 of working at Oak Creek. People sense things about other people. They sensed the weight she carried, the edges that didn't smooth down no matter how hard she tried to file them away. They sensed that Hannah Clarke was not quite like them, was operating according to some set of rules they couldn't quite identify. The only person who didn't seem to sense it was Marcus Webb in room 304, and that terrified her. Hannah ran her thumb over the scar on her left forearm, the one from the mortar shrapnel, the one that had healed into a pale line that looked like someone had carved a comma into her skin. She pressed against it until it hurt a little, grounding herself in the present moment, in Denver, in Oak Creek Memorial, in the careful fiction she'd constructed. She couldn't afford to be seen. Not really seen. Not by a seal with gray-blue eyes that seemed to recognize something he shouldn't possibly recognize. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her ex-husband, probably about their son's tutoring schedule. A message from the VA clinic asking her to reschedule her appointment. The ordinary background noise of a life half-lived, a life of deliberate minimization, a life where the most important parts of herself were locked away in a locker in the basement, gathering dust alongside combat boots that she hadn't worn in 17 years. She finished her lunch in silence and returned to the floor for afternoon rounds, moving through the wards with a kind of invisible efficiency that came from knowing exactly who she was supposed to be and knowing exactly who she absolutely could not be. The thing about secrets, though, is that they don't stay buried forever. They find ways to surface. They rise up like bodies that shouldn't stay in water, like truths that the universe won't allow to stay hidden. Hannah Clarke didn't know it yet, but in 3 days, everything was going to change. Hannah's eyes moved across Mrs. Patterson's billing statement like a radar scanning for anomalies. 20 years of military accounting training never fully left the nervous system. The ability to spot irregularities in a sea of numbers was muscle memory of a different kind. Column after column of legitimate charges scrolled past: lab work, imaging, nursing care, medications. Then she stopped. One line item refused to make sense. $47,000 for a routine normal saline flush during Mrs. Patterson's pre-chemotherapy hydration protocol. A nurse could order saline for $17. Hannah read it 3 times, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. The charge code was deliberately obscured under a billing subcategory that most staff would never question. She photographed it with her phone, habit from a different life, one that required documentation. Her hands moved with deliberate precision as she saved the image and checked the timestamp. 2:34 p.m. on a Tuesday. Evidence existed in digital form now, archived somewhere the digital void couldn't reach. Hannah closed the chart and stepped back from the nurse's station, where Patricia Chen was scheduling discharge orders and 2 residents discussed an EKG rhythm strip. Nobody looked at her. That was the gift of invisibility. She could move through their world like a ghost, carrying what they didn't see. Mrs. Patterson's family was in her room when Hannah pushed through the double doors during afternoon rounds. 3 adult children arranged themselves around the hospital bed like sentinels, along with her husband, a man in his 70s whose hand never left his wife's shoulder. Dr. Sterling stood at the foot of the bed, his posture radiating the kind of casual authority that came from knowing nobody would challenge him. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, the cadence of a man accustomed to being listened to without question. Hannah waited until he finished his assessment, blood pressure stable, white count acceptable, appetite improving, before she stepped forward. "Dr. Sterling, I need to clarify a discrepancy in Mrs. Patterson's billing codes." Her voice came out measured, professional, the exact tone of a subordinate requesting guidance. This was deliberate. This was composure styled as deference. The saline flush on this date, the charge seems inconsistent with protocol. Sterling's expression shifted. His smile didn't fade, but his eyes did something colder, something that made the Patterson daughter lean forward slightly in her chair. When he spoke, his voice carried the precision of a scalpel used as a weapon. "Miss Clarke, nurses don't concern themselves with billing. You concern yourself with bedpans and vital signs. Let the actual medical professionals handle the finances." He turned his back to her, addressing Mrs. Patterson directly. "Your care is our absolute priority. Everything here is completely appropriate." The room held its breath. Mrs. Patterson's daughter made a small noise, not quite a gasp, but close enough. Her son's jaw tightened. The husband's hand pressed harder into his wife's shoulder, a gesture of protection or apology, Hannah couldn't quite determine which. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm overhead, indifferent to the moment unfolding beneath them. Hannah felt something shift in her chest, not trembling, not breaking, but a kind of pressure release, like a valve opening in controlled increments. Her eyes remained locked on Sterling's back for exactly 1 second longer than necessary. A single tear traced down her right cheek, the biological response to humiliation that her body insisted on producing despite the absence of shame in her mind. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact as Sterling turned to face her, his smirk now visible, satisfied. The tear wasn't defeat. It was restraint. "Those files you're padding will bury you." Each word came out with devastating calm, spoken low enough that only Sterling heard it clearly, though Mrs. Patterson's family could see her lips move. Then Hannah turned and walked out, her pace exactly the same as when she'd entered, not slower from devastation, not faster from anger, but the measured stride of someone whose internal world operated on an entirely different frequency than the external one. Sterling's smile froze. His hand, which had been gesturing toward Mrs. Patterson's chart, stopped mid-motion. For exactly 1 breath, his composure flickered, just enough for the Patterson children to exchange uncertain glances. Then he continued his rounds as if the exchange hadn't happened, but something had shifted in the room's pressure, the way air changes after a lightning strike. The break room the next day was its own kind of battlefield. Hannah entered with a tray containing yogurt, a banana, and black coffee. The room fell silent the way rooms do when everyone has been waiting for a specific person to arrive so they can collectively pretend they weren't just discussing her. 3 nurses from the day shift, Rebecca, Marcus's primary care team member, and 2 others who'd worked with Hannah for years, gathered their belongings with a choreography of practiced exclusion. Their movements were deliberate, unhurried enough to seem unplanned, coordinated enough to carry the message. Within 90 seconds, Hannah sat alone at a table designed to seat 8, the fluorescent lights casting her in isolation like a spotlight. She ate methodically. Fork to yogurt container. Container back to tray. Her eyes fixed on the wall calendar with its parade of past dates crossed out in red marker. May was almost gone. She could hear them at the other table, Rebecca's laugh, a little too loud, a little too deliberately pointed. the sibilant whisper of question marks about her judgment, trailing off into plausible deniability when they noticed the silence from Hannah's direction, the attention she wasn't paying them. The disciplinary notice appeared on the oncology unit board 3 days later, laminated and positioned at eye level where no one could miss it. A formal write-up, official and damning, disciplinary action, Hannah Clarke. Insubordination. Overstepping professional boundaries. Inappropriate questioning of physician decisions. It detailed the exact moment of her transgression, the date, the approximate time, the location. Ward rounds. Room 304. Dr. Sterling noted. For a moment, Hannah simply stood before it, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the controlled fury moving through her bloodstream like a controlled chemical reaction. Then she continued her medication rounds. In room 304, Marcus Webb was sitting upright in his chair by the window when she entered with his afternoon vitals check. His SEAL Team 3 medallion hung visible against his hospital gown, the blue ribbon catching light from the Denver afternoon streaming through the windows. His eyes tracked her movements with the intensity of someone trained to read micro-expressions, to see what people didn't intend to show. "The notice on the board," he said quietly as she was wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm. "That was Sterling, wasn't it?" Hannah's hands continued their work with the same precise rhythm. "Workplace dynamics are complex. You questioned something he was doing. And he buried you for it. It wasn't a question." Marcus was watching her face, her posture, the way her breathing remained steady despite the inflection in his voice. "That's retaliation. That's illegal. It's hospital politics." The blood pressure cuff inflated with its mechanical hiss, 85/52, elevated from her baseline. Hannah pretended not to notice. Nothing unusual. But Marcus's attention had locked onto something beyond the clinical assessment. "Your voice," he said. "I've heard it before. Not recently. Longer ago than that. Afghanistan. I was very young when," he paused, something struggling behind his eyes. "Do you ever think about people you knew a long time ago? People who saved your life and you never got to thank them?" Hannah's hand stilled for exactly half a breath. When she resumed her work, her movements carried the precision of someone operating on pure tactical instinct. "I think about lots of things, Mr. Webb. Most of them aren't worth thinking about." She finished the vitals check and left his room before he could ask anything else, her pulse elevated, her composure intact. The hallway stretched before her like a tunnel with no light at the end, just the sterile fluorescent brightness of a place designed to heal people while destroying others with perfect bureaucratic efficiency. That evening, Dr. Sterling sat in his office with Hospital Administrator Richard Kovacs and Billing Director Patricia Chen. The folder on his desk contained copies of Hannah's employment file, her performance reviews, incident reports that suddenly seemed to materialize from the institutional memory like documents that had always been waiting for their moment. Sterling's fingers drummed against the desktop with the rhythm of a man who'd already won before the game began. "She's a problem," Sterling said, sliding the folder across the mahogany surface. "Started questioning charges. Undermining treatment protocols. Creating a hostile environment with her insubordination." Kovacs, a man whose title was administrator but whose appearance suggested he'd never actually administered anything more complicated than a golf reservation, frowned appropriately. "Do you have documentation of this behavior?" "Disciplinary board notice. Posted today." Sterling's smile carried the confidence of a man who understood institutional power in the way some people understood breathing. "She confronted me directly about billing matters entirely outside her scope of authority. In front of a patient's family." Chen shifted in her chair. "The Patterson account," she said carefully, "has generated significantly more revenue this year than previously." "Exactly." Sterling's tone suggested they'd just solved a complex mathematical equation together. "That's exactly what we're protecting." He made the first call that afternoon. Board member Thomas Whitmore, who'd built his consulting practice on hospital expansion contracts and owed Sterling 3 favors he'd been waiting to collect. The call took 4 minutes. The next call went to Dr. Patricia Hayes, chairman of the Medical Credentials Committee, whose daughter Sterling had written a college recommendation letter for 2 years ago. That call took 6 minutes and resulted in an agreement to review Hannah's professional standards. The third call went to a former hospital administrator named Douglas Petrie, a man whose official title was independent investigator but whose actual function was institutional cleanup, the removal of problems that institutional processes couldn't quite remove through normal channels. "I need her terminated," Sterling told him, his voice low enough that the conversation felt like conspiracy. Staff member, nurse named Hannah Clarke, started making accusations about billing practices. Petrie's response came quickly, the response of a man who'd handled these situations before. "Give me 1 week. I'll build the file." But while Sterling was making his calls and Petrie was pulling security footage that had been carefully edited to show Hannah's confrontational behavior without context, Hannah was photographing something entirely different. She'd found the altered medication orders, 3 patient charts with dosages adjusted beyond safe therapeutic levels, all modifications that generated higher billing codes, all signed with Sterling's electronic authorization. The changes were subtle enough to escape casual notice, dangerous enough to require intervention. She photographed them with her phone at 11:27 p.m. during her night shift, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her composure absolute. 3 photographs. 3 pieces of evidence. 3 moments of documentation that would either protect patients or bury her entirely, depending on which direction institutional power decided to flow. January 15th. 9:47 in the evening. Denver's power grid failed during the worst cold snap in 32 years, and Oak Creek Memorial's backup generators kicked in for exactly 12 seconds before Dr. Sterling's deferred maintenance budget caught up with reality. The lights died. The monitors went dark. The oncology ward plunged into silence so complete you could hear the ventilators switching to manual backup mode, a soft, rhythmic wheeze like something dying slowly in the dark. Hannah Clarke was in the medication room when it happened, hands moving through inventory by touch alone, muscle memory carved from 18 years of muscle memory and something older than that, something that lived in her fingers from a place called Helmand Province. She didn't pause. Didn't look up. She'd worked in darkness before. Worse darkness. She pulled the emergency supply bag from the shelf, moved toward the oncology ward with the kind of measured precision that came from knowing exactly how many steps it took to reach each room. Room 304 was where Marcus Webb's monitor flatlined. Not his heart, just the power, but his breathing had turned shallow and rapid, the kind of desperate gasping that meant air was trapped where it shouldn't be, building pressure, collapsing his lung millimeter by millimeter. A tension pneumothorax. The kind of injury that killed soldiers in places like Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, when there was no surgeon within 50 miles. The kind that killed people in pitch darkness when panic overruled instinct. 2 residents stood in the doorway, their flashlights wavering uselessly. Someone paid respiratory, one of them called, his voice climbing toward panic. "Get the crash cart. We need power." Someone find the backup, his words scattered like birds. Useless. The crash cart was a dead machine in a dead room, and respiratory wouldn't arrive in time to help. Hannah entered with her own flashlight, the beam steady as a surgeon's hand. She saw Marcus Webb's face in the white light, his eyes wide, his chest heaving, and she saw something else too. Recognition flickering at the edges of his awareness. The same eye she'd carried 3 miles through hostile territory 18 years ago, now belonging to a man with Navy SEAL insignia on his hospital chart and terror working its way through his composure like water finding cracks. She had 90 seconds. Maybe less. "Both of you." "Lighting," she said. The residents turned, understanding nothing, but her voice carried the kind of authority that didn't wait for questions. They moved. Their flashlights converged on Marcus's exposed chest, and Hannah's hands were already moving, palpating the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, finding the landmarks her body remembered better than her mind did. The skin was cool under her fingers. His breathing was getting worse. "Marcus, I need you to trust me." Her voice dropped an octave, something ancient and certain settling into it. "This will hurt. But you're going to breathe afterward." She didn't wait for consent. She'd stopped asking permission 18 years ago, and some habits were written in bone. She reached for the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the emergency supply tray she'd brought, alcohol swab already in her other hand, her movements flowing into each other like choreography. The skin, the antiseptic, the needle entering at a precise angle, and then the hiss of air escaping. Pressure releasing. Months of combat training compressed into a single moment of decompression, and she knew, before she even saw his chest rise properly, that he would breathe. That the collapsed lung would re-expand. That she'd done it exactly right. Marcus's breathing deepened. His eyes found hers in the darkness, recognition flooding through him like a wave breaking. That voice, he gasped. Helmand. The medic who carried, his voice cracked, understanding and memory colliding. You're the one who. Hannah placed her hand over his, not rough, not gentle, just steady. Save your strength. You're safe. She withdrew her hand, moved to check his vitals, and in that single moment she felt the weight of 18 years of carrying his secret settle heavier on her shoulders. He knew. Or he was beginning to know. And there was nothing she could do about it except make sure he lived long enough to understand why she'd never told him. She moved through the ward for the next 2 hours with the kind of purposeful silence that came from someone who'd already survived the worst. 7 critical patients. 7 monitored by hand, by pulse, by the kind of clinical instinct that couldn't be taught in nursing school because it came from places where there was no backup, no protocol, no safety net except your own hands and your own refusal to let people die. One patient with Coptic exacerbation, she positioned him upright, cleared his airway, managed his breathing through reassurance and positioning. Another post-operative cardiac patient whose pain management depended on Hannah's assessment alone, she palpated his abdomen, checked his incision, made decisions that would normally require a doctor's signature, and made them correctly. An elderly woman coding from sepsis, Hannah started manual chest compressions in the dark, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this while helicopter rotors shook the ground around her. By midnight, when the generators roared back to life and fluorescent lights flickered across the ward in a stuttering resurrection, every patient was stable. Every monitor showed clear rhythms. Every chart showed competence that couldn't be hidden, even in darkness. Especially in darkness. Hannah stood in the hallway, her hands trembling with something that wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of control that came from knowing exactly what you were capable of and choosing not to let anyone see it. Dr. Sterling arrived at 1:15 in the morning, his expression calculating as he moved through the ward, surveying the controlled chaos, the stabilized patients, the evidence of successful crisis management. He pulled Marcus Webb's chart, his eye scanning Hannah's documentation of the needle decompression, the time, the procedure, the patient outcome, every detail recorded with the precision of someone who'd done this before. His jaw tightened. She could see it happen in real time, the moment he understood that Hannah Clarke's competence had become visible. That in the darkness, when there was nothing left but skill and instinct, she'd revealed something that institutional hierarchy couldn't hide anymore. What he didn't know was that Marcus Webb was asking the nursing staff questions about the medic who'd saved him 18 years ago. What he didn't know was that Marcus had started piecing together the timeline, the voice, the hands that moved like they'd been trained in places he recognized. What he didn't know was that in 72 hours, everything would become clear. But Sterling felt the shift. He could sense the way the balance had changed, the way Hannah's silence had become more dangerous than any accusation could be. He stepped into the hallway, his phone already in his hand, and made the first of 3 calls that would seal his own fate. Board members who owed him favors. Investigators he'd already fed carefully edited security footage to. A narrative he'd already started constructing, the nurse who'd gone off protocol during a crisis, who'd made unauthorized decisions, who'd endangered patients in the dark and only gotten lucky that nobody died. It wasn't true. But truth, Sterling had learned long ago, was less important than who was telling the story. 3 days. 72 hours since the blackout. 72 hours since Hannah Clarke performed a needle decompression in absolute darkness and saved a Navy SEAL's life with nothing but a 14-gauge catheter and 20 years of muscle memory no one at Oak Creek Memorial was supposed to know she possessed. Her badge wouldn't activate the staff entrance at 7 in the morning. She stood at the glass doors, card in hand, watching the light blink red. 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 The mechanism that had opened without thought for 18 years now treated her like an intruder. She swiped again. The reader made a sound like a sigh, a soft electronic rejection that cut deeper than any raised voice. 2 security guards waited inside the nurse's station. Hannah recognized both. Marcus, who'd helped her carry a dementia patient back from the garden last spring. David, who always said good morning without expecting an answer. They weren't smiling. The cardboard box sat on the counter next to them. Standard size. The kind used for moving belongings. Her belongings. Dr. Sterling stood behind them in his immaculate white coat, Douglas Petrie from administration on his left, Patricia Chen from HR on his right. A committee assembled. A firing squad dressed in business casual. Sterling's expression held something that looked like satisfaction but tasted like poison when Hannah read it correctly, the expression of a man who'd finally achieved something he'd been maneuvering toward since the moment she'd questioned that $47,000 saline charge 3 weeks ago. "Miss Clarke," Sterling said, his voice smooth as expensive leather. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately." Hannah didn't move. Didn't blink. Her hands remained at her sides, steady as stone. Insubordination, Patricia Chen read from a document, her eyes fixed somewhere past Hannah's left shoulder. Unauthorized procedures. Practicing beyond scope of license. Violation of physician-directed care protocols. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Somewhere in the distance, a monitor beeped its mechanical heartbeat. The ordinary sounds of a hospital morning, continuing without change, indifferent to the wreckage being assembled in the nurse's station. "I saved 7 lives during the blackout," Hannah said. Her voice came out steady, measured, the same careful tone she used to explain medication side effects to frightened patients. No anger. No defense. Just fact. Sterling's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man holding cards he'd already played, certain of the hand he'd won. You performed a surgical procedure without physician supervision. You administered medications without orders. You exceeded your licensure. He paused, letting each word settle like a stone into still water. That's grounds for license review with the state board. I've already submitted a formal complaint. Patricia Chen extended the termination paperwork, her hands trembling slightly. She was a good person, Hannah had always thought. The kind who followed protocol because she believed the system worked. She didn't look at Hannah's face. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your address on file, Douglas Petrie said, his voice apologetic in the way of bureaucrats who'd learned to soften bad news with practiced sadness. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. Marcus approached, his expression tight with discomfort. Ms. Clarke, I'm real sorry about this. We'll just walk you to your locker, okay? Shouldn't take long. She nodded once. Moved toward the corridor. The hospital had already begun its transformation. Nurses who'd worked beside her for years suddenly found urgent tasks in patient rooms. The physical therapist Hannah had trained in peripheral for techniques turned and pushed through a door. A resident who'd asked her opinion on differential diagnoses just last week stared hard at his phone, pretending its screen held secrets that required complete attention. She walked down the corridor, blue linoleum, cream-colored walls, the smell of industrial cleaner mixing with something underneath it, something organic and wrong, the way hospitals always smelled if you'd spent enough time in field tents learning what blood and infection actually smelled like when you had no choice but to breathe it. Her locker was in the back, near the staff bathroom. Standard issue hospital issue. Grey metal, combination lock, nothing distinguished it from the 30 others in the row. She opened it. Inside, 3 photographs of Ethan at different ages. One from his 8th birthday when he'd insisted on a demolition derby theme. One from his high school graduation last June, his smile bright and unbroken by knowledge of what his mother really was. One from the day he was born, her ex-husband's arm around her shoulders, both of them young and certain the world held promises they could keep. Her coffee mug from the hospital cafeteria, Oak Creek Memorial, 10 years of service embossed on the ceramic in fading gold lettering. And at the bottom, wrapped in a grocery bag, the pair of worn combat boots. Desert tan, scuffed, the leather creased from 1,000 miles of operations. Helmand Province dust still visible in the seams despite her careful cleaning efforts over the years. Bloodstains on the inside left heel she'd never been able to get completely clean, belonging to a boy who wasn't a boy anymore. She placed everything into the cardboard box. The photographs went in first. The mug next. She held the combat boots for a moment, felt their weight, their reality, their stubborn insistence on existing as proof of something she'd spent 2 decades trying to forget. Marcus stood nearby, not meeting her eyes. David had stepped away entirely, positioning himself at the far end of the corridor as if distance might absolve him. Hannah placed the boots in a box, on top of the photographs. Wrapped the grocery bag around them again. Closed the lid of her former life. The walk to the elevator took exactly 4 minutes. She counted each second, each footfall, the way she'd learned to count heartbeats in field hospitals when every pulse was data, every beat a message about whether someone would live or die. 37 staff members were present in the corridor during those 4 minutes. She knew this without counting because she'd trained all of them, and habit was a voice that spoke even through her composure, even through the careful numbness she'd wrapped around herself like a field dressing. Marcus Webb, still in room 304, heard the commotion, the wheels of the cardboard box sliding across linoleum, the muffled sounds of departure. He pulled at his fore, trying to stand, his stitches protesting, his body moving despite medical reason because some parts of training never leave you, and he recognized the ghost walking past his window. His nurse, Patricia with the kind eyes, gently restrained him. "Mr. Webb, you'll tear those stitches. The doctor said you need another 2 days of bed rest." He managed one glimpse of Hannah's back as security led her to the elevator. That was all he needed. He recognized the set of her shoulders. Recognized the way she moved through space like something displaced from itself, present but distant, the way warriors moved when they'd just lost something that mattered. The elevator doors closed. The security guards who'd escorted her out didn't follow her past the lobby. There were protocols even they wouldn't cross. Hannah walked to the parking garage, placed the cardboard box in the passenger seat of her 2008 Honda Civic, and drove home through Denver traffic in the middle of the morning, past people living ordinary lives, past coffee shops and parks and a school where children played without understanding that the world was held together by people who learned to function in the dark. That evening, she sat in the waiting room of the VA hospital facility on West 14th Avenue, intake form trembling in her hands. The paper itself was ordinary, questions printed in 10-point Helvetica, checkboxes for service branches, drop-down menus for discharge status. But her hands shook as she read the final section. Have you ever been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder? Have you experienced nightmares related to combat operations? Do you have difficulty maintaining employment due to service-related injuries? Around her sat the visual evidence of what happened when the system broke. A Marine with a prosthetic leg, fitted and precise, the technology of replacement a daily reminder of everything that was missing. An Army specialist rocking slightly in his chair, his eyes tracking something invisible, his jaw working on words his throat wouldn't release. A Coast Guard petty officer with burned scars mapping the right side of his face like a continent of pain. Their shattered eyes mirrored her own. She knew those eyes from field hospitals, from tent cities in Kandahar province, from the night Marcus Webb's childhood self had stared at her while blood ran down his face and she'd made a choice to carry him instead of staying behind with the others. She knew those eyes from watching soldiers die because the supply chain failed, the orders were wrong, the mission was impossible, and the only reasonable response was to become unreasonable in return. For 20 years she'd treated warriors like these. In ICUs, in field hospitals, in a tent held together with duct tape and prayer. She'd been one of them, was one of them, had spent 2 decades pretending the hands that saved lives were steady hands, were normal hands, were hands that belonged to a woman named Hannah Clarke who pushed a mop and folded hospital linens and had never heard a helicopter rotor wash or carried a boy 3 miles through fire or understood that some knowledge, once gained, carved itself into your nervous system where it lived permanently. The hands that saved Marcus Webb still shook when she closed her eyes and smelled diesel fuel mixing with something else, something organic and wrong, the way blood and infection smelled when you had no choice but to breathe it. The intake nurse called her name. Hannah Clarke. She stood. The form felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She walked to the desk, placed it down, watched the nurse's eyes scan her answers, watched the moment of recognition happen, the moment when someone realized the quiet woman across the counter had done things that mattered. Combat veteran, the nurse said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Her voice held something like respect. How long has it been? 20 years, Hannah said. Since Helmand Province, correct? It says here. Yes. The nurse nodded. Handed Hannah an appointment card. We start with talk therapy. EMDR if you're willing. Medication if you need it. But first, we listen. She made eye contact in a way that felt like witnessing. You're not the first person to walk in here believing you had to survive alone. Hannah took the appointment card. It was dated 3 weeks out, a small rectangle of paper promising something she'd spent 2 decades refusing to believe she needed. I'll be here, Hannah said. For the first time in 20 years, she checked the box marked combat veteran seeking PTSD treatment. The hospital board meeting had been scheduled for 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of administrative gathering that usually meant budget cuts and staffing reductions, the kind where Dr. Sterling would sit at the head of the polished mahogany table wearing his accolades like armor. The conference room windows overlooked downtown Denver, the Rocky Mountains visible in the distance like a reminder that some things endured longer than reputations. Sterling adjusted his tie, silk, Italian, probably worth more than Hannah Clarke's monthly mortgage, and prepared to accept commendations for maintaining standards during the Blackout crisis, the narrative already written, the victory already his. The board chair was mid-sentence, praising his exceptional leadership under unprecedented circumstances, when the double doors burst open with the sound of hinges protesting sudden movement. Ethan Clarke stood in the threshold, 16 years old, his mother's jawline and his grandfather's stubborn shoulders, holding a shadow box against his chest like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His voice cracked when he spoke, the kind of crack that comes from anger held underwater for too long. Mom, they fired you, he said, his eyes finding the board members, landing finally on Sterling with the precision of a target acquisition system. They need to see these. He crossed the room in 8 measured strides and set the shadow box on the conference table with the reverence of someone placing a coffin. The room didn't just go quiet. The silence became a physical thing, the kind that makes fluorescent light sound deafening, the kind that tastes like copper and consequences. The shadow box held 32 square inches of burnished oaken museum-quality glass, and beneath it lay the medals arranged in ascending order of prestige, each one a story the world had never asked to hear. Hannah Clarke had never displayed them. Never mentioned them. Never spoken about the wars that had carved themselves into the spaces between her ribs. The board members leaned forward as though drawn by gravity itself. Sterling's face had gone the color of spoiled milk. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again, but no sound emerged, a predator suddenly recognizing the apex in the room. The conference room doors opened a second time, and this time the silence deepened into something archaeological. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb wore his Navy dress uniform with the kind of precision that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment since January, since the blackout, since the moment he'd opened his eyes in room 304 and recognized the hands holding his life together. He was lean like a knife blade, his movements economical, his presence making the air pressure change as if the room itself was struggling to accommodate someone who'd walked through too much fire to be invisible. He stepped forward until he stood directly behind the shadow box, and when he spoke, his voice came from a place deeper than rank, deeper than protocol. It came from debt and memory and 20 years of wondering about the ghost who'd carried him through Helmand Province. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, he said, each word a nail being driven. The board chair's hand froze halfway to a coffee cup. One of the hospital lawyers shifted in her seat as though the chair had suddenly developed teeth. Sterling's breathing had become audible, the sound of someone drowning in air. Webb continued, his eyes never leaving the medals, Helmand Province, 2004. I was 8 years old. She carried me 3 miles through active combat. Mortar fire. Taliban in the ridgeline. She didn't stop. She didn't hesitate. She kept moving. The hospital administrator, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd spent 30 years navigating the politics of healthcare, reached for the shadow box with trembling hands. She opened it with the care of an archaeologist, and as she read aloud, her voice developed a tremor that hadn't been there moments before. Navy Cross, she whispered. The room absorbed that information like stone absorbs rain. Then, 2 bronze stars. Purple Heart, 2 of them. Combat Action Ribbon. Intelligence Star. She stopped, her eye scanning the citation card beneath the final medal, the words coming out in a voice barely above a breath. Classified Operation, 23 casualties prevented, 43 Marines extracted under fire, medical intervention in denied territory. Patricia Chen looked up from the box and found Hannah Clarke's face in her memory, the quiet nurse who'd folded linens, who'd made coffee, who'd questioned a $47,000 saline charge and been destroyed for it. Before Sterling could formulate words into defense, before his institutional armor could reassemble itself, the conference room door opened a 3rd time. The FBI agent who entered was tall and silver-haired and carried the weight of 6 months of investigation like a coat he'd grown accustomed to wearing. His name was Agent Reeves, and he placed a folder on the table with the finality of a judge's gavel. Federal investigation into billing fraud spanning for years, $87,000 in fraudulent charges, he said, his eyes locking onto Sterling like a sniper acquiring a target. The investigation was triggered by a complaint filed by Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke on January 16 of this year, 3 days post-emergency blackout. Reeves opened the folder and scattered documents across the polished mahogany like evidence at a crime scene. 19 additional victims identified. 2 terminated employees, 6 forced resignations, 11 current staff members who report retaliation and intimidation for questioning billing practices. Sterling's hands had begun to shake. His lawyer whispered something urgent into his ear, but Sterling waved him away with the gesture of a man watching his world collapse in real time. The board chair, a woman named Eleanor Hastings who'd led Oak Creek Memorial for 12 years and had never seen anything remotely like this, stood up from her seat with the deliberation of someone standing to pass judgment. Her voice was ice given the ability to speak. Dr. Sterling, the board votes unanimously to revoke your clinical privileges at this institution, effective immediately. Your medical license has been referred to the Colorado Medical Board for disciplinary review. You are banned from all patient care areas except as a patient. Security will escort you from the building. Sterling stood, his chair scraping backward with the sound of something being dragged from a grave. His mouth worked soundlessly. His hands formed fists and unclenched them and formed fists again. He looked at Marcus Webb like he might say something, then at Hannah Clarke, and finally at the shadow box sitting open on the conference table, and in that moment, his face registered the full architecture of his miscalculation. He had looked at a quiet nurse and seen weakness. He had seen compliance and mistaken it for submission. He had not seen the scarred hands that had held lives together. He had not seen the woman who'd chosen to become invisible rather than remain dangerous. And by the time he understood, it was far too late. 2 months later, Hannah Clarke stood in the chief nursing officer's office on the administrative floor of Oak Creek Memorial, the shadow box now displayed on her desk beside a framed photograph of her SEAL team from 2004, young Marcus Webb at age 8 being held in her arms, both of them dust-covered and alive. She'd implemented a new hospital policy requiring dual physician review of all billing charges exceeding $5,000. She'd mandated ethics training for every employee who'd been complicit in Sterling's system of retaliation. The 7 nurses who'd shunned her in the break room during her exile had requested transfers. She'd approved 3 and assigned the remaining 4 to mandatory sensitivity training. You don't run from mistakes, she'd told them. You learn from them. The 3 who'd shown her kindness in the darkness had received promotions, their names read aloud at the all-staff meeting, their integrity made visible. Sterling, meanwhile, had negotiated a plea deal with federal prosecutors, 8 years in federal prison, full restitution, permanent loss of medical licensure. But before the plea, During the 3-week period of negotiation, he'd taught CPR certification courses at Front Range Community College, his punishment already beginning while the law's machinery churned slower. $130 per hour, teaching chest compressions to bored community college students on a Tuesday afternoon, teaching them to revive the very people he'd spent for years defrauding. Hannah had passed his classroom window once on her way to a community outreach event, Ethan walking beside her. She'd paused. Her son had noticed. "That's him?" he'd asked. She'd nodded once and kept walking. "That's what happens," she said quietly, "when you forget healing is about the patient, not the paycheck." That evening, Hannah placed the pair of worn combat boots on the mantle in her living room where they belonged, no longer hidden. The Helmand Province dust still clung to the leather despite 2 decades of storage. The blood of an 8-year-old boy who'd grown into a decorated Navy SEAL marked the left heel. She didn't hide them anymore. She couldn't. Some stories demand to be told, and some warriors don't wear uniforms because the uniform doesn't matter. What matters is the choice to stand when everyone else looks away. What matters is the quiet strength that moves through darkness, saving lives even when nobody's watching, even when the cost is your own safety, even when the world forgets your name. Marcus Webb had visited 2 weeks earlier, cleared for limited duty and shipping out to Virginia Beach within the month. He'd sat across from her desk and listened as she explained the VA paperwork, her first PTSD counseling session now scheduled and attended, the nightmares beginning to loosen their grip after 2 decades of silence. "You saved my life twice," he'd told her. "Once in Helmand when I was a kid, once in room 304 when I'd given up trusting anyone." She'd shaken her head. "There's no debt between us, Marcus. We take care of our own. That's what warriors do." He'd gripped her hand, his grip like steel cable, hers steady as a surgical laser, and promised to visit on leave, promised to carry forward the legacy of Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, the woman who'd taught him that heroism doesn't require medals, though sometimes medals follow heroism anyway. Ethan found his mother on the couch that evening, the boots visible on the mantle through the front window, catching the last light of the Denver sunset, throwing shadows that looked like the silhouettes of mountains. "Why did you hide them so long?" he asked, settling beside her. She considered this carefully, her voice the voice of someone who'd spent 20 years learning to speak truth. "I thought being a warrior required a uniform and a weapon. Took me 20 years to understand that the bravest battles are fought in hospitals instead of deserts, and the truest warriors wear scrubs instead of combat fatigues, and their scars are just as real, just as permanent, just as worthy of being seen." She reached over and squeezed her son's hand. "You don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You just need the courage to stand when everyone else looks away. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, judged by what you appeared to be instead of what you actually were, then you know exactly why Hannah Clarke kept those boots hidden for so long. But you also know the power of the moment when the truth surfaces, when the world finally sees you clearly, when your worth becomes impossible to deny." Subscribe to this channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments, have you ever had to prove who you really were to people who thought they already knew? Thanks for listening.